They built the house to shelter a family, but the doors inside sheltered something else, something that never let go once it was opened. Long after the Wainwrights were gone, the ridge still breathed with the sound of hinges, as if the house itself remembered every step that ever passed through its rooms. The Wainwright house stood on a rise above the Tennessee Valley, its timbers dark against the sky, its roof pitched like a watchful brow. Built in 1850, it was not the largest home in the region, nor the grandest, but it had a presence that lingered in the eye long after one turned away. Neighbors remembered the sound of its doors before they remembered the shape of its windows, the echo of iron hinges that seemed always to sigh, even when the air was still. It was a house made not only of oak and stone, but of silence, and in that silence people found more to fear than comfort. From the road, travelers saw a structure that looked at once sturdy and peculiar. Its frame was hewn from oak so thick it might have resisted storms for centuries. The planks had been smoothed and fitted with unusual care, as though the builder meant for the walls to last longer than the family who would dwell within. Yet the house was restless in its design. Doors seemed to multiply across its facade. A front door, a back door, side doors that opened toward nothing more than the slope of the ridge, and a row of smaller doors that dotted the east wing like misplaced windows. Even the barn was built with more entrances than exits, as if the Wainwrights feared not being able to leave quickly enough. Inside, the strangeness deepened. Visitors who crossed the threshold found themselves in rooms that felt too narrow or too wide, as though the measurements of the house shifted according to some logic no carpenter had written. Hallways ended in doors that led to broom closets no larger than a coffin. Cupboards opened into crawl spaces that tunneled into shadow. And then there were the stairwells, some of which led to landings that opened onto walls instead of rooms. The family explained it away with a smile, saying the builders had been careless, or that the old Wainwright patriarch had insisted on additions no one quite understood. But neighbors noticed the way the family's eyes dropped whenever the subject was raised, as though the matter was not meant for conversation. It was said the house breathed differently from other homes. On cold mornings, the windows fogged as if someone were exhaling from within the walls. At night, when the wind blew hard across the valley, the house groaned like a ship in water, its beams creaking in tones too deliberate to be chance. Children who played on the ridge swore they heard doors opening when no one was near, the heavy clunk of iron latches, followed by a silence that left them running home breathless. The Wainwright family accepted their house as it was, for it was theirs. Samuel Wainwright spoke with pride of its timber frame, its endurance against the weather, its view over the valley. His wife, Margaret, kept its hearth warm, its floors swept, its lamps burning long after dusk. But the children, Eliza, Thomas, and the younger twins, were less certain. They whispered to one another of footsteps in the upper halls, and the way some doors resisted their hands, as though something behind them was holding fast. By the time the first winter settled over the ridge, the house had already begun to weave itself into local story. Farmers on their way to market muttered about the number of doors, shaking their heads at what they called a house too eager to be opened. The minister, passing by on his rounds, noted that its chimneys smoked at hours when the valley slept, and travelers, when offered a bed within its walls, often chose instead the cold safety of their wagons. The Wainwright home was meant to be a place of shelter, of family, of pride. Yet even at its birth, it carried the air of something unfinished, or perhaps something too finished, as though it had been built not for the present, but for another time entirely. The Wainwrights were a family of standing in their valley, not the richest planters in Tennessee, yet prosperous enough to command respect. Their land stretched in neat rows of tobacco that smoked the air with its bitter scent come harvest, and their cattle grazed in wide, fenced pastures that rolled down toward the river. Samuel Wainwright, tall and stern with a beard the color of iron filings, was the sort of man whose word at the market carried weight. He dealt fairly, if not always warmly, and though he was not beloved for his charm, he was trusted for his constancy. His wife, Margaret, softened his edges. She was known to send pies to widows in the parish, to leave preserves on church steps without asking recognition. Together, they were a couple of modest means elevated by their diligence, admired for their work ethic, and marked by one curious distinction: the house they had built upon the ridge. In town, when neighbors spoke of the Wainwrights, they rarely did so without mentioning the house. It was not its size that stirred talk, for others lived in larger homes nearer to the river. Nor was it its age, for several cabins along the valley floor had stood longer. It was its shape, its unsettling architecture, the fact that no one could quite remember how many doors or rooms it contained. Men who came to bargain for cattle returned shaking their heads at the way a door in the parlor opened onto what appeared to be a second parlor, identical yet subtly shifted, as though one were the shadow of the other. Women who came to share tea with Margaret left sooner than expected, murmuring about how they lost their bearings moving from kitchen to hall, and how the light through the windows seemed never to fall at the same angle twice. Despite these whispers, the family themselves remained above reproach. The Wainwright children were polite in church, their clothes well mended, their lessons recited without falter. Samuel tithed faithfully, his silver dollars clinking against the collection plate with the weight of duty. Margaret sang in the choir, her voice steady even when the rest of the congregation wavered. They opened their doors to travelers when storms flooded the low roads, and their table was known to bear more food than most. Hospitality was their shield, a reminder to all that, however odd the house might seem, the family within it upheld the values of the community. Yet hospitality could not entirely erase unease. Some neighbors wondered aloud why Samuel, with his wealth, had not built a more conventional home. Why had he demanded so many doors, so many corridors? Why did he keep a key ring heavy with locks, jangling at his belt like a jailer's? No one asked him outright, for Samuel was not a man easily questioned. But when gossip passed from one porch to another, the tone always circled back to the house, and to the sense that the Wainwrights, for all their uprightness, were touched by something just beyond the ordinary. So they lived in a peculiar balance, prosperous enough to avoid suspicion, devout enough to silence rumors, yet never entirely free of the glances cast toward the ridge when the wind shifted and the house creaked like a thing alive. The Wainwrights were respected, yes, but respect was not the same as trust, and in Tennessee in 1850, a family who lived in a house of too many doors would find trust hard to keep. It was the extra door that began to unsettle people. At first, it was a curiosity, the sort of thing a guest might chuckle over after supper, pointing out the oddities of the house while Margaret poured coffee and Samuel explained it away with a shrug. "A builder's mistake," he would say, tapping his pipe against the hearth. "Carpenters with too much whiskey and too little sense." Yet for all his easy dismissal, the house itself refused to let the matter rest. The first of these oddities stood in the hallway between the dining room and the east wing. A narrow door, fitted with iron hinges like all the others, opened only to reveal a wall of planks pressed so tight and clean it was as if the room had been swallowed whole. Visitors laughed, but the laughter faded quickly when the wall seemed warmer than it should have been, as if heat lingered there long after the fire downstairs had died. Another door was discovered in the cellar, a low wooden hatch beneath the stairwell. When opened, it revealed nothing more than packed earth. But the earth was smooth, too smooth, as though hands had pressed it flat. A man from the parish once tapped at it with his boot heel and swore it sounded hollow beneath, though Samuel quickly ushered him back upstairs before more could be said. There were others. A pantry door that sometimes stuck, and when forced, opened onto shelves that did not belong to Margaret, rows of jars filled with cloudy liquid, none labeled, none familiar. The next day, when the pantry was opened again, the jars were gone, and in their place stood flour sacks and beans as if nothing had been changed. Then there was the upstairs door that led to the nursery. A straightforward entrance most days, but on more than one occasion, Margaret found it locked from the inside. When Samuel broke the latch, the room was empty, the children asleep in their beds on the other side of the house. Guests began to whisper that the Wainwright home had more doors than rooms, as though the house itself were multiplying passageways beyond the family's control. Samuel laughed at the talk when he heard it, insisting that settlers in rough country learned to live with imperfections. But neighbors carried the unease back with them, shaking their heads at the thought of a man so precise in his dealings, tolerating such sloppiness in his own walls. What unsettled them most was not the doors themselves, but the way the family reacted. Margaret's smile always tightened when one was mentioned. The children grew quiet when asked to fetch something from behind a locked latch, and Samuel's laughter, though full, never quite reached his eyes. The Wainwrights lived among the doors as though they were not mistakes at all, but obligations, something to be endured, explained away, and never truly spoken of. The Wainwright children were known to be lively, their laughter carrying across the ridge like birdsong in the evenings. Eliza, the eldest daughter, was a steady hand in the household, but it was the younger ones, Thomas and the twins, Abigail and James, who made the walls echo with games. They loved to play hide and seek, slipping behind curtains, squeezing beneath staircases, and vanishing into the folds of their strange home. At first, it was harmless amusement, the sort of mischief every child finds in the gaps and corners of a large house. But over time, the game began to change. The house gave them too many places to hide. Doors that seemed useless to adults became endless invitation to children. One afternoon, Eliza counted to 20 with her hands pressed over her eyes, only to find that the twins were gone. Not simply tucked behind trunks or curled in the pantry, but gone altogether. She searched until her throat ached from calling their names. Hours later, they appeared in the parlor, barefoot, their hair damp as though they had been running through rain. Yet outside the windows the day had been dry and still. It happened again, and then again, until Margaret grew pale with worry. The children would slip through a door, sometimes the pantry, sometimes the cellar hatch, sometimes one of the narrow upper doors that should have led to linen closets, and they would not return until long after they were missed. When they came back, their eyes seemed strange, unfocused, as though they were looking at something just beyond the reach of the room. They answered questions with half smiles or silence. Abigail once whispered to her mother that she had been walking in the wrong yard, though she would not say what that meant. James, when pressed, only said he had seen people in the upstairs hall, people who did not move when he waved. Neighbors who visited noticed the change too. The children, once bright and quick with chatter, grew distant after these wanderings. They sat longer in silence, their gazes drifting to corners no one else bothered to notice. At night, Margaret sometimes found them awake, standing together by one of the unused doors, hands clasped, listening as though waiting for a sound. When she called to them, they turned slowly, their eyes glassy, their expressions unreadable. Samuel tried to forbid the games. He locked doors, nailed some shut, even hung blankets over the stubborn ones, yet the children still disappeared. Locks turned themselves, nails slid loose, blankets sagged as if pulled aside. By morning, the little ones always returned, pale and tired, but never willing to say where they had been. What they carried back was not dirt on their shoes or leaves in their hair, but something heavier, something that pressed into their silence. And though the family tried to live as if all was normal, the truth was plain. The Wainwright children were learning to wander into places no child should ever go. It began with whispers, faint and uncertain, drifting down the ridge on nights when the air was still. The Wainwrights themselves said little of it, but the neighbors noticed. A farmer, returning late from market, told his wife he had heard voices on the wind as he passed the orchard, low, wavering tones that rose and fell as if caught in conversation. At first, he dismissed it as the family lingering awake, perhaps Samuel reading aloud to the children by lamplight. But when he passed again weeks later and heard the same murmur, he realized it was not the cadence of scripture or story, but something stranger. The words were indistinct, too muffled to understand, yet clear enough that he knew they did not belong to his own imagination. Soon others spoke of it too. Women gathering at the churchyard muttered of voices that carried through the night, not the bright chatter of children, nor the steady baritone of Samuel, but sounds thinner, stretched, as though spoken from a room one could not enter. Some said they resembled prayers, others thought they were laments. A few swore they were not words at all, but tones, rising and sinking like breath against glass. Whatever they were, they unsettled those who heard them, for the Wainwright house stood too far from the road for ordinary voices to travel so far. Margaret dismissed the talk when it reached her ears, insisting that the valley carried sound in peculiar ways, that the creak of trees and the cry of animals could fool tired minds. Samuel laughed when pressed, saying the house itself groaned like a living thing, and neighbors mistook timber for tongue. Yet their denials never carried weight, for the stories continued, and the witnesses multiplied. A pair of hunters swore they had camped near the ridge and woken to the sound of conversation just beyond the trees. They lit their lantern, thinking they might find trespassers, but the woods were empty. The only thing that moved was the door of the smokehouse, swinging open and shut on hinges that should have been latched. The whispers became a subject of quiet fascination. Men lingered longer at fence posts when speaking of it, lowering their voices as though afraid the sound might carry back to the ridge. Women hushed their children when the subject was raised, warning them not to wander near the Wainwright property after dusk. And when the nights grew long, neighbors began to admit what none wanted to say aloud, that the voices did not sound entirely human. They were too steady, too patient, too much like echoes repeating themselves long after the speaker should have gone silent. What unsettled people most was that the Wainwrights themselves seemed unchanged. Lamps still burned in the windows, smoke still rose from the chimney, and the children still appeared in church, sitting stiffly beside their mother. But the house, with its too many doors and restless timbers, had begun to speak, and if a house could whisper, the valley wondered, what else might it be listening for? The autumn of 1851 brought a stranger to the ridge, a traveling salesman by the name of Andrew Cole, though some in town recalled him only as the man with the satchel. He had passed through the Tennessee Valley before, selling knives, needles, and small mirrors to farm wives, and so the Wainwrights thought little of offering him shelter when a storm rolled in from the west. Margaret set a place for him at supper, and Samuel poured him a measure of whiskey. The children lingered at the table, wide-eyed at his stories of riverboats and distant towns, their laughter mingling with the thunder outside. When the hour grew late, the guest was shown to the east wing, a part of the house rarely used but always kept ready for visitors. The room was ordinary enough at first glance: a narrow bed with a quilt folded at the foot, a washstand with a porcelain basin, a window that looked out toward the orchard. Andrew thanked his hosts, set his boots neatly beside the bed, and unbuckled his satchel. He promised he would be gone by dawn, for the road was long and his trade could not wait. Margaret wished him good rest, and Samuel locked the front door before retiring upstairs. The house groaned as the wind pushed against its beams, and all settled into uneasy sleep. Morning came, pale and cold, the storm having passed in the night. Margaret rose first, stoking the fire and preparing bread for the day. Samuel went to rouse their guest, knocking politely on the east wing door before pushing it open. What he found halted him in the doorway. The bed was empty, the quilt folded back, but the room bore every trace of its occupant. The boots still sat by the bedside, dust from the road clinging to their soles. The satchel rested on the chair, clasp undone, its contents spread as though examined before sleep combs, bits of cloth, and a ledger of names. Yet of the man himself, there was nothing. No sound of footsteps, no mark of departure, no open window through which he might have slipped away. The family searched the house, calling his name, but the silence pressed heavier than before. Doors were opened, closets checked, even the cellar hatch lifted, though no trace of Andrew Cole was found. The road outside showed no new tracks, the morning dew unbroken. By midday, Samuel carried the satchel into town, and told the minister what had happened. The minister frowned but said little, only that travelers sometimes moved on quickly, leaving behind what they no longer needed. Yet in private, those who heard the tale shook their heads. No man abandons his boots, not on a road as rough as the Tennessee Valley. From that day, the east wing stood empty. Margaret cleaned the room, folded the quilt, and closed the door, but the family rarely spoke of it. Neighbors, however, never forgot. They whispered that the house had taken its first guest, and that the man with the satchel had stepped through a door that did not lead where it should. Samuel Wainwright was not a man given to fancy. He measured his days in bushels and cattle weight, in the slow turning of seasons that told him when to plant and when to reap. Yet even a practical man can be pressed into strange habits when the ordinary fails him. By the winter after the traveler vanished, Samuel began to keep a ledger, a thick-bound book of rough paper and ink that he hid in the drawer of his desk. At first it contained notes as dry and practical as his dealings at market, lists of feed, records of debts owed, repairs done on fences. But gradually, the entries changed. He began marking the doors of his own house. The first page was simple enough, a sketch of the floor plan as best as he could render it, each door numbered. Alongside, he wrote small remarks in his clipped hand: stable, pantry, linen closet, but then appeared notations more curious. Door 6 sometimes leads to wall, sometimes to hall. Door 11 pantry, but twice revealed jars not our own. Cellar hatch earth firm one day, yielding the next. He wrote without flourish, as though he were cataloging livestock, yet the weight of his words was undeniable. Margaret noticed the change in him. At supper, his eyes wandered to the hall, lingering on the closed doors as though waiting for them to shift before his gaze. He carried the ledger with him at odd hours, opening and closing doors, scratching notes in the margins. The children grew wary of his inspections, for they sensed what he was doing was not entirely safe. Thomas once whispered to Eliza that their father was counting the wrong things, and though she asked what he meant, he refused to explain. Samuel's entries grew darker with time. One described how the east parlor door, when opened on a foggy morning, showed him a field not his own, its soil black and wet, though no rain had fallen in Tennessee that week. Another told of the narrow door beside the nursery that opened onto a stairwell descending far deeper than the house could allow. He did not step beyond the threshold. He only listened, hearing what he described as the hum of distance, like a hive buried in stone. By lamplight he mapped these changes, crossing out and rewriting, circling doors that would not remain constant. On one page, he scrawled a single line heavier than the rest. The house does not settle. The house alters. The ink had pressed so deep it scored the paper. Margaret found him one night at his desk, staring at that sentence as though it accused him. She asked why he troubled himself with such things, but he only closed the ledger and told her some burdens were his alone. Neighbors saw nothing of this, only that Samuel grew quieter, more withdrawn, his hand always brushing the ring of keys at his belt. But within the Wainwright house, the ledger grew thick with entries, each one a tally against certainty, a record of a home that no longer obeyed its own walls. At the far end of the second-floor hallway, past the nursery and the narrow storage room, there stood a door that the family avoided more than any other. It was plain to look at oak like the rest, iron handle cool to the touch, but it seemed to lean in on itself, as if the very frame resisted the weight of what it contained. For months it remained closed, unnoticed among the others, until one autumn evening when Eliza, chasing after her younger brother, turned the handle and swung it wide. What lay beyond was not a room, not a closet, not even the bare face of a wall. It was hollow blackness, a void so complete that it swallowed the light from the lantern she carried. She cried out, startled, and Samuel came running, wrenching the lantern from her hand. He thrust it forward into the space, expecting to see boards, dust, perhaps a forgotten chamber. Instead, the flame guttered and dimmed, its glow vanishing into the darkness as though absorbed. No walls reflected back, no floorboards creaked beneath. There was nothing, only an emptiness so deep it seemed to breathe. He pulled the door shut hard, the latch snapping into place with a sound that echoed down the hall. From that night on, the door was spoken of in hushed tones. The children dared one another to touch its handle, though none lingered long enough to turn it. Margaret, who kept the keys, tried to convince herself it had only been a trick of shadow, yet she flinched whenever her hand brushed the iron ring that fit its lock. Samuel, who wrote carefully of every door in his ledger, left only one line for this one: Door 17 hollow, nothing more. Neighbors who heard of it did not believe at first, until one evening a farmhand sent to deliver a parcel lingered too long upstairs and returned pale, muttering about the dark that eats. Word spread quickly, and before long the hollow room had become a story told at church suppers and fence lines. The Wainwrights, once admired for their hospitality, now found fewer guests willing to stay the night, for who could sleep comfortably in a house that contained a door opening onto nothing? The door remained, silent and patient at the end of the hall. Sometimes the family swore they heard faint sounds from behind it, not voices exactly, but the low hum of distance, as though wind moved through a canyon far away. At other times the handle rattled gently on its own, as though stirred by a draft that no one could feel. The Wainwrights learned to pass it quickly, heads lowered, steps quickened, knowing that a single turn of the hand could reveal again the emptiness waiting just beyond. Eliza Wainwright was 14 when she began writing letters to her cousin in Franklin, a girl her own age who had never seen the house on the ridge but knew enough of its reputation to be curious. At first, Eliza's letters were ordinary, filled with the chatter of farm life, the harvest of tobacco, the bleating of calves, the endless chores that kept her hands raw. But as autumn deepened, her words began to change. The first strange letter arrived folded neatly, the handwriting smaller than usual, as though she feared someone in her own household might read it. In it, she confessed that she had stepped through the north-facing pantry door one evening and found herself not in the kitchen but in a yard that looked familiar and yet entirely wrong. She wrote that the air felt thicker, the sky a duller shade, and the carriage standing in the drive was not her father's, though it bore the Wainwright crest. Men stood by it in clothing she did not recognize, coats cut long, collars high, their speech clipped and formal, words bent in an older rhythm. They looked at her but did not see her, their gazes sliding past as though she were no more than smoke. She tried to call out, but her voice sounded strange in her own ears, doubled, as though someone else spoke with her. Frightened, she turned back through the pantry door and found herself once more in the lamplit kitchen, the familiar smell of beans boiling on the stove. She said nothing of it aloud, but she wrote it all to her cousin. In later letters, she described the experience happening again. Sometimes, the pantry opened onto her mother's shelves, orderly and neat. Other times it revealed streets she had never walked, wagons rolling over cobblestone instead of dirt, voices calling out names she had never heard. Once she said she saw her own house, but different, its beams darker, its roof sagging as though years had passed. Smoke rose from the chimney, yet she knew her family was not inside. "I believe," she wrote in one trembling line, "that the door shows years not yet lived, or years already gone." Her cousin never replied to those letters. Perhaps the girl's parents intercepted them, unwilling to feed the strangeness. Perhaps she read them in secret and dared not answer. But Eliza continued writing, her words filling pages with careful description, as if she hoped that recording them might keep her tethered to the present. The letters would later be found in a cedar trunk, tied with ribbon, her script neat but hurried, the ink often blotched where her hand shook. In them, the story of the house grew not from rumor, but from the steady hand of a daughter who had walked, if only for moments, into the wrong year. When the talk in the valley grew too loud and the whispers too pointed, Margaret Wainwright sent word to the minister. She had grown pale from sleepless nights. Her eyes shadowed not only from worry for her children, but from the weight of what she felt within the walls of her home. The pastor, Reverend Thomas Hale, was a man of stern bearing, not quick to believe in superstition. Yet he had heard enough from his congregation to know the Wainwrights lived under a shadow, and so he came one afternoon with his Bible tucked under his arm and a flask of water drawn from the church font. Samuel greeted him stiffly at the door, for though he respected the minister, he was not a man who sought counsel easily. Still, he stepped aside, and the Reverend entered. The house was quiet, the children hushed, the air heavy as though it knew what was about to unfold. Reverend Hale began in the parlor, reading aloud from the Psalms, sprinkling water on the beams, marking the doorway with his thumb. His voice carried steady as he moved from room to room, his prayers reverberating against the walls that had too often echoed with whispers not his own. The family followed at a distance, Margaret clutching Eliza's hand, Samuel trailing with his jaw tight. In the pantry, the minister paused, his eyes lingering on the north-facing door that had unsettled the daughter. He traced the sign of the cross above it, but did not linger long. In the upstairs hall he moved slower, his steps heavy as if the floor resisted. At the end of the corridor he came to the door of the hollow room, and for a moment his voice faltered. He raised his hand as though to touch the handle, then drew back, his lips pressed thin. Finally, he came to the east door, the one Samuel kept locked, the one no guest had ever passed through since the traveler's disappearance. He placed his hand upon the frame, his palm trembling slightly, and closed his eyes. After a long silence, he turned to the family and shook his head. "There are places," he said softly, "that God did not grant us to enter." His words carried the weight of finality. He did not sprinkle the door with water, nor did he pray aloud before it. Instead, he turned away, his face gray, and descended the stairs. The blessing ended as quietly as it began. Reverend Hale took his leave with little more than a nod, refusing supper despite Margaret's insistence. Outside, he mounted his horse quickly, riding back toward the valley without once looking behind him. From that day, the Wainwright house remained marked not by holy water or scripture, but by the absence of a prayer left unspoken at a door that no one wished to open again. When word spread that the Wainwright house required repair, a pair of carpenters from the valley agreed to take the work. They arrived with tools slung across their shoulders, confident in their craft, for both had raised barns and mended cabins across Tennessee without ever faltering. Yet the moment they stepped across the threshold, their confidence faltered. The house did not welcome their measuring eyes. Beams leaned subtly where no weight pressed them, floorboards bowed though no dampness had touched them, and the angles of the rooms resisted the square as though mocking their skill. The first carpenter, a man named Jennings, knelt to inspect a doorframe near the pantry. He ran his hand along the grain and frowned. Instead of running straight, the lines of the oak spiraled inward, curling upon themselves like the ridges of a thumbprint. He tapped the wood with his knuckles, expecting a hollow sound, but the tone shifted with each strike, sometimes deep, sometimes sharp, as if the wood itself were layered with unseen chambers. His partner, McCall, meanwhile examined the hinges of the east wing. They were affixed backward, pinned in such a way that the door ought not to swing at all. Yet when he tried it, the iron turned smoothly, the door gliding open without resistance. He checked twice, muttering under his breath, but found no explanation. As they moved deeper into the house, unease grew. A supporting beam in the parlor stood off-center, its base notched into the floor where no joist existed. Above it, rafters crisscrossed in patterns that could not have supported their own weight, and yet they held, unmoving, as if the air itself braced them. Jennings whispered that the house was impossible, that it did not obey the geometry of common sense. McCall, less given to words, simply spat on the floorboards and said he would finish no work here. Samuel pressed them for answers, but their only reply was a shaking of heads. One claimed the house must have been built in haste, with errors left uncorrected. The other said nothing, only packed his tools and refused payment. They left before sundown, their faces pale, and warned the family not to ask for repairs again. Afterward, Samuel examined the wood himself, tracing the spirals with his calloused fingers, staring at the beams that leaned without falling. He wrote in his ledger that night, "Patterns unnatural." Grain like living skin, Margaret begged him to let it be, but he could not shake the feeling that the house had been shaped by more than human hands. From then on, the family ceased inviting tradesmen inside. The Wainwright home, with its twisted patterns and impossible angles, would be mended only by those who already belonged to it. It was late in the evening when Samuel Wainwright decided to test the cellar hatch himself. For months, he had recorded its strangeness in his ledger, noting when it revealed nothing but hard-packed earth and when the ground beneath it seemed to yield like sand. He had heard the children whisper of shadows moving behind it, had seen their pale faces when they returned from their wanderings, and he could no longer endure ignorance. Lantern in hand, he lifted the hatch and lowered himself into the dark. At first, there was nothing unusual. His boots pressed into cool dirt, the smell of damp soil rising sharp and heavy. He swung the lantern forward, expecting to see the stone wall that marked the edge of the foundation. Instead, the light stretched out, revealing not stone, not earth, but a wooden doorframe where no door should have stood. He hesitated only a moment before stepping through. When his foot struck the floorboards beyond, the air changed. The musty scent of earth gave way to the warm smell of wood smoke and stew. The dim light of the lantern paled against the glow of an oil lamp set on a kitchen table. Samuel froze. The kitchen was his own, yet not as it was. The chairs gleamed with fresh polish. The walls bore no soot stains. And at the table, seated with her hands folded neatly, sat a woman he had not seen in 20 years. His mother looked up at him with the same tired eyes he remembered from boyhood, her apron dusted with flour, her hair bound in a scarf. He could not speak. His throat closed around words that had long gone unsaid. She greeted him as though no time had passed, asking whether he had fed the calves, whether the tobacco leaves had been bundled for curing. He tried to answer, but his voice sounded strange to his own ears, hoarse and broken. He stumbled forward, reaching out, but before his hand touched hers, the lamplight flickered. The air shifted cold, and the scene blurred as though drawn into shadow. The next moment, he found himself back in the cellar, lantern still in hand, the hatch gaping above him. The smell of damp earth pressed close again, and the kitchen was silent. Climbing out, he stood trembling, unsure if he had dreamed. Yet, when he entered the real kitchen, the chair where his mother had sat was dusted faintly with flour, though Margaret had baked nothing that day. That night Samuel wrote in his ledger with a heavy hand. Cellar hatch led back, saw her alive. He underlined the words twice, the ink blotting through the page. From then on, he avoided the hatch, but his eyes lingered on it whenever he passed. The house had shown him not only what was gone, but what it could return, and he knew such a gift carried a weight too great for any man to bear. By the winter of 1852, the Wainwrights no longer spoke of their home as a collection of rooms and beams. They had begun, cautiously at first, to treat it as something more. Margaret was the one who named it first, murmuring to Eliza one night that the house listens. She meant it in passing, a half-whisper of fear when the walls groaned overhead, but the words took root. Soon every sound seemed to prove her right. The creak of the staircase when no one climbed it, the soft thud of a door latching though no hand was near, the draught that swept through the parlor carrying with it the faint smell of smoke or rain when the night outside was calm, these things began to feel less like accidents and more like the stirrings of a memory too large for human keeping. Samuel resisted the thought, but he could not deny what he saw in his ledger. His entries grew less like measurements and more like testimonies, a record of the house's moods rather than its structure. He wrote of doors that opened onto rooms exactly as they had been years before, down to the smallest misplaced toy or candle stub. He noted the way the boards in the nursery floor groaned in the same rhythm as his mother's tread, though she had been in her grave for decades. In one margin, he scribbled a line that he later tried to cross out but could not. The house remembers what we forget. The children, too, sensed it. They would place their ears against the walls, as if listening for voices, and sometimes laughed at jokes no one else heard. Eliza confessed in her letters that the air in the upstairs corridor sometimes carried the faint sound of hymns long out of fashion, as if a congregation were singing from another year. Margaret found her youngest son one morning tracing the spiral in a beam with his finger, whispering that the wood was telling him a story. She pulled him away, but her hands trembled. Even the neighbors noticed from a distance. Those who walked the ridge at dusk swore the house groaned like a living body settling its weight, and more than one farmer claimed the windows flickered with lamplight even on days when Samuel swore no lamps had been lit. The house had ceased to be merely a shelter. It was a witness, holding not just the lives within its walls, but the imprint of every life, every moment, every silence that had passed through it. Each breath of wind through the eaves felt like lungs drawing air, each shift in the beams like bones remembering strain. The Wainwrights no longer doubted. Their house did not merely contain time. It remembered it, and in remembering, it refused to let any of them forget. The spring of 1854 brought with it a grief that the Wainwrights could neither speak of nor escape. It began as so many of their troubles had with a game. The children had long since grown accustomed to the house's strange moods, to its doors that opened onto places they should not, to its whispers that brushed against their ears like gnats in the dark. They had been warned, scolded, even locked out of certain rooms, yet curiosity in the young is a fire not easily quenched. One afternoon, when Margaret was tending to the wash and Samuel was working the cattle, the twins Abigail and James slipped from sight. At first, it seemed another round of hide and seek. Eliza, now nearly grown, called for them through the halls, expecting giggles from behind curtains or the thump of hurried footsteps on the stairs. But the laughter never came. She checked the pantry, the cellar, even the hollow room at the end of the corridor, though she dared not open its door. The house was silent, too silent, as though it had already swallowed their noise. When Margaret realized they were gone, her voice rose sharp with panic, echoing through the beams, until even Samuel heard it from the fields and came running. The search began at once. Every door was flung open, every closet overturned, every corridor retraced. Samuel descended into the cellar, lantern high, his voice hoarse from shouting their names. Yet the earth beneath the hatch was smooth, undisturbed. Outside, the family scoured the orchard, the pasture, the ridge. Neighbors joined them, lanterns swinging as the night deepened, dogs sent to sniff the fields. But there were no tracks, no broken branches, no scraps of clothing caught on thorns. It was as if the twins had stepped through one of the house's doors and never returned. For days, the search continued. Men rode as far as the river, combing the banks for signs of small bodies carried downstream. Women prayed in the church, whispering Margaret's name with pity and fear. Yet nothing was found. The valley grew quiet with unease, and neighbors began to keep their children closer, warning them away from the ridge. In the Wainwright house, grief hardened into silence. Margaret wept until her voice was gone, then moved through her chores with a hollow stare. Eliza sat for hours by the pantry door, waiting for a sound that never came. Samuel wrote only one entry in his ledger, the words etched so deep they tore the paper. Taken by the house. After that, he closed the book for weeks, unable to look at the truth he had written. The valley never spoke of the missing children as if they had wandered. They spoke of them as if the house itself had claimed them, and in the years to come, no one would pass the ridge without remembering the twins who went in but never came out. By the summer after the twins vanished, the Wainwright house no longer belonged only to the family who lived within it. It had become the talk of the valley, a name spoken low at supper tables, a shadow that reached beyond the ridge. Neighbors, who once traded freely with Samuel and sat at Margaret's hearth for coffee, now crossed themselves when the subject arose. Fear had grown roots, and from those roots sprouted whispers that spread like weeds. Farmers began refusing to visit, even when business called for it. Samuel brought his tobacco to market himself, shoulders bent beneath the stares of men who would not meet his eye. They muttered that no crop, no matter how fine, was worth walking through a house that swallowed children whole. When the minister called for aid in tending the fields of widows, the Wainwrights' name was never mentioned, as if by ignoring them the community could undo the unease. The children of the valley, braver in their ignorance, turned the fear into a game. They would creep up the overgrown lane to the ridge, hearts pounding, daring each other to touch the brass knobs of the doors that lined the porch. Some claimed the handles were icy cold, even in the heat of July. Others swore they felt a faint hum beneath the metal, as if the wood beyond were alive with a breath too deep to name. Few lingered long enough to test the truth, for their courage always broke at the sound of a creak, whether from hinge or their own imagination. They would flee down the hill, laughter ragged, boasting of bravery that had nearly deserted them. Yet, each retelling grew the story larger, darker, until even the boldest avoided the ridge at night. The mothers of the valley forbade their children from joining such games. The house keeps what it wants, they warned, pulling little hands away from fence posts and turning their faces back toward home. Around hearths they muttered that God had marked the Wainwright family, that the vanishing of the twins was no accident but a judgment, a curse carried in the wood of the house itself. Some remembered the traveler who had disappeared years before, and their whispers grew louder, binding the tales together into a single thread of dread. From the windows, Margaret saw the way neighbors skirted their land, how wagons turned at the fork rather than pass too near. The house, once built to be a monument of their means, now stood like a warning. Its doors no longer opened to welcome, they closed against the world, and the world was grateful for it. The Wainwrights remained inside, carrying their grief, while outside the valley decided the truth for them. The house had chosen, and once chosen, it would never let go. It was in the spring of 1855 that the orchard itself betrayed the family. The apple trees were just beginning to bud, their branches tipped with white blossoms that promised a good harvest, when Samuel noticed something standing at the far edge of the grove. At first, he thought it no more than a broken fence post or a shed frame left half-built. But as he drew nearer, his breath caught. It was a door solid oak like those in the house, banded with iron hinges, but freestanding, with no wall, no frame of timber to anchor it. It stood upright in the grass, balanced as though it had grown there overnight. Samuel called for Margaret, and together they walked around it. From the back, it was nothing but a flat plank, the iron latch protruding uselessly into the air. But from the front, it carried the same weight as any of the doors in their house, the grain of the wood spiraling inward, the handle gleaming faintly in the afternoon sunday. Samuel reached for it, then stopped, his hand trembling. Margaret whispered that it was not meant to be touched, but he ignored her warning and pulled the latch. The door swung open easily, too easily, and behind it was no tree, no fence, no rolling hills of Tennessee. There was only darkness, not the ordinary dark of shadow, but a depth that seemed to breathe. A gust of wind pushed through, strong enough to lift Margaret's hair and scatter blossoms from the branches. The air smelled of rain, though the sky above was cloudless, and with it came a sound low, distant, like the moan of a storm caught in a hollow. Samuel slammed the door shut and stood panting, his knuckles white against the latch. For days afterward, the orchard felt altered. The grass around the door grew pale, as if the roots beneath had withered. Birds avoided the trees nearest it, their song breaking off whenever they flew too close. The children, drawn by curiosity, lingered at its edge, whispering dares to one another. Eliza swore she saw shapes moving in the dark when the door opened a crack on its own one evening, though no hand touched it. Margaret tried to coax the family away, to pretend it was not there, but even she could not keep her eyes from drifting to it whenever the wind rustled the blossoms. The neighbors soon heard of it, for nothing in the valley stayed hidden long. Some claimed it was a sign of the devil's work, others that it was a punishment for the children already lost. But the Wainwrights knew better. This was no punishment, no accident. The house had grown restless, and now its strangeness had spilled beyond its own walls. The orchard door stood as proof that what lived within the ridge was no longer contained, and perhaps never had been. By the summer of 1856, Samuel Wainwright had grown gaunt with frustration. The ledger of doors sat thick with entries he could no longer explain, the children gone and the neighbors whispering of curses, and each creak of the beams above him pressed heavier than the last. He no longer trusted the house that bore his name, nor the orchard where the freestanding door still loomed like a sentinel. At last, in a moment of grim resolve, he decided to do what he had sworn never to attempt. He would burn it. If the east wing held secrets too dark for God's sight, then fire, the oldest and most certain of purifiers, would have to speak for him. He waited until nightfall. Margaret tried to dissuade him, her voice breaking as she begged him not to provoke what they could not control, but Samuel was deaf to her fear. He carried oil and kindling to the east wing, doused the floorboards until the air grew sharp with its fumes, and struck a match. The children huddled at the stairwell, their eyes wide as the first flames curled up the walls. For a moment, it seemed to work. The fire caught with hungry eagerness, bright tongues of orange rising, licking at the beams until the room glowed with heat. But then, without warning, the flames began to bend inward. Instead of spreading along the timbers, they drew tight into the walls themselves, folding into the wood as though swallowed whole. The family watched in horror as the blaze devoured its own light, vanishing into cracks that moments before had been bare. The smoke rose but did not linger. It streamed into the beams, pulled as though by some hidden breath. In minutes the fire was gone. The walls stood blackened for a heartbeat, then smoothed, whole and unmarked, the grain of the oak unscarred. The smell of oil still hung in the air, but the east wing looked as if no flame had ever touched it. Samuel dropped the spent match from his hand, his face pale and hollow. Margaret wept openly, clutching the children to her skirts, but the house gave no sign of having been wounded. It stood as silent as before, the doorways lined in shadow, the hinges gleaming faintly in the lamplight. Only the floor beneath Samuel's boots bore any trace of change, a faint warmth, as if the house had drawn the fire into itself and was holding it, waiting. From that night, no one in the valley believed the Wainwrights could ever leave the ridge. Fire had failed them, prayer had failed them, and still the house endured, untouchable, as if it were less a home than a living thing determined to outlast its keepers. The letters were found years later, tucked into a cedar trunk that Margaret kept at the foot of her bed. Folded neatly and bound with a ribbon, they bore Eliza Wainwright's careful hand. The ink faded but still legible, each page marked with the weight of a young girl's unease. They were written to her cousin in Franklin, but whether they were ever posted, no one could say. The envelopes remained unsealed, as though Eliza herself had hesitated, uncertain whether to send them into the world or hide them where only time could bear witness. One letter in particular, dated in the autumn of 1856, carried the strangest account. In it, Eliza confessed that she had stepped through the west parlor door late one evening, after her parents had gone to bed. She claimed she expected to see nothing more than the familiar shelves lined with crockery and the hearth smoldering low. Instead, the air grew suddenly cold, and when she opened her eyes, the parlor was not her own. The floorboards beneath her feet were raw and splintered, as if freshly laid. The walls stood bare of plaster, and through the gaps she could see fields rolling out in a way that no longer matched the present landscape. She wrote that she heard voices then, men speaking in tones older than her father's, their accents thick, their words bent by an earlier century. She peered from the doorway and saw them gathered by a rough-hewn table, coats long and plain, faces weathered. They did not look at her, and yet, somehow, they spoke her name. Eliza, they said, each syllable heavy, as though they were testing it, pulling it across their tongues. She froze, unable to breathe, unable to answer, and when they turned toward her at last, their eyes seemed not to see her face but something within her. as if she were less a girl than a memory they had been waiting to recall. Terrified, she stumbled backward, grasping for the door handle. She swore the wood pulsed warm beneath her palm, beating like a vein, and when she pulled it shut, she was once again in her family's parlor, the hearth glowing faintly, the shelves just as she had left them. Yet the sound of her name still lingered in her ears, as though spoken from a great distance. In another letter she begged her cousin not to think her mad, insisting that the door had carried her into a year-long past, perhaps 1790, when the valley was raw and half-wild. She described the men's eyes as filled with recognition, as if they had always known she would come. "I think the house remembers for them," she wrote, "and through its remembering, it calls me." The words ended abruptly, the ink blotched, the final lines unfinished. Whether she meant to say more, no one ever learned. The letters were folded, bound, and hidden, silent testimony to the fact that Eliza had not only seen the strangeness of her home, but stepped directly into the past it refused to forget. By the dawn of 1860, the Wainwright house had fallen into silence, or what seemed at first to be silence. The family was gone, whether by choice or by force of something larger. No one in the valley ever agreed. Some said Samuel took what remained of his kin and fled west under cover of night, unwilling to lose more children to the hunger of his own walls. Others whispered that the house itself had finished its choosing, swallowing the last of the Wainwrights without so much as a cry for help. Whatever the truth, the ridge stood bare of smoke, its fields untended, the orchard overgrown, and the shutters drawn tight over windows that once glowed with lamplight. Neighbors, cautious but curious, ventured close in the months that followed. They found the front door locked from within, the iron latch refusing to yield. Curtains hung limp in the windows, and weeds had forced their way up through the cracks of the porch. Yet the air around the place was never still. On quiet evenings, those who passed swore they heard doors opening and closing in steady rhythm, the sound of latches lifted and hinges groaning as though unseen hands moved from room to room. Sometimes the noise came in bursts, as if doors were thrown wide all at once. Other times, it was slow, deliberate, a single door closing softly again and again until the hair rose on the back of the listener's neck. A group of boys, braver than most, dared each other to creep up onto the porch one autumn afternoon. They pressed their ears against the wood and claimed to hear footsteps pacing just beyond the door, slow and measured, as though someone waited on the other side. When one boy reached for the handle, the knob rattled before his fingers touched it, and they scattered down the ridge in terror, refusing to speak of what they had felt. Travelers passing through the valley learned to avoid the ridge altogether. Word spread that wagons broke down near the lane, that horses balked and refused to move forward. Those who ignored the warnings often returned pale, claiming they had heard voices calling their names from the shuttered windows. A few swore they had seen the hollow room flicker with lamplight, though no one lived to tend the flame. By the close of the decade, the Wainwright house was no longer spoken of as a home, but as a thing left unfinished, a wound in the land. Empty though it appeared, it seemed to breathe still, each groan of timber and whisper of latch a reminder that absence does not always mean peace. On the ridge above the Tennessee Valley, the house endured, waiting, as though time itself had refused to let it go. Time has stripped the ridge of nearly everything that once bore the Wainwright name. The fields where tobacco once grew have folded back into grass. The orchard, once kept neat and orderly, is now a tangle of wild branches, roots thrusting out like gnarled fingers. The house itself is gone, at least in the way most people mean when they say a place is gone. Its walls have rotted, its roof collapsed, and the grand frame of oak that once defied storms lies scattered in pieces across the ground. Yet the foundation stones remain, moss-covered and stubborn, forming the faint outline of rooms no one dares step into after dark. To walk the ridge is to walk a graveyard without graves, where the land itself seems restless. Locals still speak of it, though never with ease. On still nights, when the air is thick and the valley sleeps, the ridge comes alive with sounds that no wind can make. People swear they hear the groan of hinges echoing faintly across the hills, as though doors long since buried still swing open and shut. Some describe it as steady, measured, the rhythm of footsteps pacing from room to room. Others claim it is more violent, the crash of doors thrown wide, followed by the hush of them closing softly, as though someone were testing each entrance to see which one still leads where it should. Hunters returning from the woods have spoken of hearing footsteps behind them, slow and deliberate, only to turn and find the ridge empty. Travelers say the air grows colder when they pass near the stones, a chill that sinks into the marrow even in high summer. A few, bolder than most, have camped at the site, daring the night to prove the stories false. They rarely last until morning. More than one has left their tent and belongings behind, fleeing down the ridge with nothing but terror in their eyes. The house has become less a ruin than a presence, woven into the folklore of the Tennessee Valley. Parents still warn children not to wander too close, muttering that the Wainwright doors never stopped opening, even when the house itself fell away. Some say that if you stand among the stones and close your eyes, you can hear a latch lift beside you, and the faint shuffle of footsteps moving past. Where they go, no one can say. The house may be gone, but what remains is something deeper, a memory carved into the ridge itself. The Wainwrights vanished, the timbers decayed, but the sound endures, doors opening onto nowhere, and footsteps walking through the spaces between years.